Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode 120 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Robert David Booth. Robert served as a special agent with the State Department's Bureau of Diplomatic Security all over the world for nearly 30 years, including in Beijing, Geneva, Tokyo, Haiti, and Paris. He was the Deputy Director for the Office of Counterintelligence from 1996 until 2002, and afterwards served as a consultant for the same office until 2012. I invited Robert onto the podcast to discuss his career with the State Department and several of the very famous and infamous espionage cases he worked on over the years, which he covered in his book, State Department Counterintelligence: Leaks, Spies, and Lies. But before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at krishiki.com. Krust himself scours the continent for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at very affordable prices. Find it all at krishiki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. And use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. Robert, thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about something that's dear and near to my heart.
Oh, I'm glad. I love these conversations, honestly. I look forward to them every single time. And, I've had your book for quite some time, and I'm glad that we were finally able to get in touch because you have a little bit of a low profile online, honestly. I don't know if you realize that.
I have a small website. Keeping a low profile is what I did in State Department. In fact, State Department and the Bureau of Diplomatic Security keeps a very low profile. Sometimes people confuse us with the FBI or the Secret Service because we do some of the same things that they do, so that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. So what was it that led you into the State Department in the first place?
Well, my father was a State Department officer, and I lived overseas for 16 years of my life, so that I got to meet these wonderful women and men that were working in the embassies and then in other places where we saw people at the military bases, that I said, I want to do what these women and men do. They really are interested in serving their country. And I said, that's what I wanted to do. I actually started out at the Naval Academy, but during orientation, I realized my free spirit and military discipline was not going to work. So I decommissioned, and I went to college. And while I was at college, my father advised me that the State Department has a law enforcement component called the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. It was actually called the Office of Security back then. And so then I applied for it, and that's how I entered. I was actually 21 years of age when I joined on October the 7th, 1974.
Oh, wow. Okay, very young. So can you tell me a little bit about this Office of Security and the CI division specifically?
Well, within the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, they have the Office of Counterintelligence, and that bureau is broken down into three components. The first component is the Office of Investigations, which are those agents that actually go out and do counterintelligence and counterespionage investigations. Another component is the analytical branch, which reviews and looks at all the reports coming back from our embassies overseas, which analyzes how local governments, both friendly and hostile, actually target embassy personnel and how we might go about to confront that and mitigate. And the third component of the counterintelligence office is the educational staff. And that staff is responsible for coming up with programs that allow us to send our people overseas on a periodic basis to educate our embassies overseas, but also to educate our young Foreign Service officers here in Washington, D.C., to what counterintelligence looks like.
Hmm. Okay, yeah, quite a multifaceted role there. And, it occurs to me, Robert, that State Department personnel make such fantastic targets because not only do they have access to the information that you want, but in a sense, they come to you because they're already in your country, they're already moving in your government circles, and they're already interacting with your people a lot. And, there's very, very little risk for the Foreign Intelligence Service compared to them having to send their own people here to the United States to, try to get somebody working at the Pentagon or in the Beltway, something like that, for example.
You're absolutely correct, Justin, because an embassy overseas has components of the State Department and other federal agencies. I'm not supposed to name, but we have DOD is overseas, FBI overseas, we have intelligence agencies overseas, all working inside an embassy. So that then when they're working inside that territory, be it Paris, France, or be it Moscow, our embassy officers are out there in the field trying to, let's be clear about this, elicit information that allows the government, the White House back here, to execute foreign policy. We have embassy personnel, let's say in a place like Tunisia, they're out there meeting government Tunisians, they're meeting private industry, they're meeting students, they're meeting journalists, all reporting back to Washington, D.C. about what the Tunis landscape looks like. But to the Tunis government, that might be almost spying and it might be almost hostile. So, for a lot of governments, both friendly and not so friendly, an American embassy represents a bit of a threat to their integrity. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have to educate our young officers inside an embassy about what they need to do in order to make themselves secure.
Okay. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Do you think by any chance that there is, I don't want to say naivete, but is there more like idealism among those than there might be among other services like the young personnel that are stationed in the U.S., whether it's DOD or FBI agents or somebody like that? Do you think that there's more idealism that everything's going to work out if we just connect with our foreign partners, on a personal level, for example?
Great question. And the comparison I would make would be a Foreign Service officer and a U.S. scientist. When you have a U.S. scientist who's working overseas, be either in Africa or Asia, trying to work with their counterparts, let's say trying to work about a disease issue, a plague issue, trying to work about how do we solve medical issues, a State Department officer is in the same position, believing his or her counterparts are good people and we want to resolve the same problems. So we have to educate our young officers to remind them that even though what they're doing is good work, there are people in that country who may want to compromise that.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly. So I want to ask you a question. You just kind of mentioned in passing a little story. I think it was in your intro, maybe, or very early in the book, about you had cause to meet with a U.S. soldier who had defected to China during the Korean War, immediately after the Korean War.
That's a very interesting case. I was actually assigned to the United States Liaison Office in 1976. We weren't even an embassy back then. To show you how old I am, the ambassador at that time was George Herbert Walker Bush, who became,
Oh, wow.
yeah, he become our next president. In any case, I was the duty. I know. I was the duty officer that day when this this middle-aged man kind of walked into the liaison office, and I said, "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" He says, "Well, I need some help." And back then in 1975, we just did not have American citizens in China. That just didn't happen in Beijing. And I said, "Well, sir, how can I help you?" He says, "Well, I want to go back to the United States." And I said, "Well, just take your passport and go to the airport. There's no problem." He says, "Well, I don't have a passport." And I said, "Well, how did you get here?" He said, "Well, during the Korean War, at the end of the war, I chose not to return to the United States." And of course, my eyebrows go to the top of my head. And
Oh,
I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Well, I was a soldier. I was captured by the North Koreans. And at the end of the war, I was one of, I think it's 40 or 50 who decided not to go back. I'm not going to go where they brainwash or they educated." And he simply didn't come back to the United States. Whatever the psychological officers managed to do was convince him to stay in the region. And he had a life, as he told me. He had gone to a tool factory in the southern part of China. He'd married a Chinese woman. He had a couple of kids. But he had learned that his mother was on a deathbed and he wanted to go back and say goodbye. So he came to the American liaison office in Beijing in an attempt to get a passport. We didn't have consular services at the liaison office because we were not an embassy, but an officer by the name of Jerome Ogden was the technical consular officer. So he came out, heard his story, went back to try to prepare what was called travel documents, not a passport. So I talked to this man about what it was like, his life was like there to live in China as an American citizen. And the big debate was, do you allow this guy to come back to the United States and then prosecute him for being a traitor or a deserter? And so that was my first inkling into diplomacy, because eventually the decision was made, let him come back and see his dying mother. And he's going to come back to China. What purpose would it be to prosecute this 18, 19-year-old kid who made a bad decision? It's kind of like the Bergdahl case in Afghanistan, which is very different what happened. So what happened was we issued him a travel document. He came back to the United States. He got to see his dying mother, saw his relatives, and then he returned back to China, which he was, at that particular point, he was as Chinese as anybody.
Wow. What an incredible life that guy lived. Did you get the impression from him that he was deeply regretful? I mean, did the conversation go in that direction at all?
No, not at all. I was trying to be very helpful for him because, you realize he's an older gentleman at this particular point. I'm assuming he made, review about what he did, and that his final decision was that he would go ahead and remain in China.
Okay, I see. Do you recall his name even now after all this time,
Oh
by any
gosh,
chance?
oh gosh, I do not. I apologize. I do not.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I did an interview about those guys, or I did an episode about them over a year ago now. I'll have to look up which episode what it was, but a very, very fascinating story about the level of psychological control and manipulation that led to them, those guys deciding to stay behind. I think the book was called We Fight for Peace.
Okay.
That was a really, really interesting episode, really interesting interview in a book as well. And I was shocked when I saw in your book that you had actually ran into one of those guys face to face, 20 years later. So I'm
I
really
mean,
glad to hear what happened in that case.
he was just a very humble individual. And I think over the years that caused him to reflect upon what he did. And he made the decisions as an 18-year-old. I mean, think about the decisions you and I made at 18 years of age.
Oh, yeah.
And, and he's living with it. And as far as I knew from I talked about the fact of his wife, I think he had 3 children. He was comfortable. He'd made his peace with life and that, but he wanted to see his mother. And that, I think, the U.S. government, be both DOD and DOJ and State Department, I believe, made the right decision. There was absolutely nothing gained by allowing him to come back to the United States and then trap him, and prosecute him. That would just have been terrible optics.
Yeah, I have to agree there. And it seems like he's, paid for the consequences of that decision
Yeah.
in many ways, probably ways that we'll probably never know, as a matter of fact. But I do kind of feel some sympathy for people at a very young age making a poor decision, or a consequential decision anyway in the heat of the moment, and then suffering the consequences of that for many years to come. So it was the wrong thing to do, and it was certainly
Yeah.
prosecutable, but,
Oh, of course.
he's already dealing with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. What an interesting brush with history there.
Unusual, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So you cover several very, very interesting stories in depth in the book, and all things that happened to you during your career. And I wanted to ask you first about Donald Kaiser. As a matter of fact, I've seen a number of articles about him before I even read about him in your book. So can you tell me when you first bumped into him?
Again, it was at the United States Liaison Office in Beijing, China in
Oh, okay.
1976. He arrived there as a young political officer, and he arrived with a bit of a reputation. He was a fluent Mandarin speaker. People talked about his expertise in talking to people. He'd write great reports. When he first arrived there at the liaison office, he was very friendly to the security office, and he was just a really good guy, really nice guy. I liked him.
Okay. So the reputation was a positive one then because of his control of the language?
Right, but he'd actually been in Taiwan to learn Mandarin. When he joined the State Department, he was sent back, so that his fluency in the Mandarin language was quite considerable. So we were looking forward to him be able to, like I said earlier, to get out in the street, maybe talk to people, maybe get a few of the Chinese people to provide them insights to what was going on to their personal lives or what might be going on in their commercial lives. Absolutely.
Okay. I see. And so did that reputation bear out? I mean, was he a pro while you were working with him there?
Oh, he was incredible. Everyone couldn't wait to get Don Kaiser's reports. His reports
Hmm.
were erudite. They were great. They had the humor to it. He would meet other diplomats, and Australian and French and Pakistani diplomats there at different kind of dinners and everything. And he'd come back to the embassy that night. I'm part of the liaison office, and write up these reports we couldn't wait to read because he just wrote well. And that's is critical to foreign service officers is the ability to write and report well from what they've seen and
Hmm.
witnessed.
Sure. That's impressive stuff. So obviously we're talking about him because there was some problems later on, but were there any early indications now that you can look back with hindsight and see any issues that might arise in the future when you first met him?
Well, what I came to understand before he arrived at Beijing, China, he had abandoned his first wife and had an affair with a woman while he was at George Washington University. Then he kind of his first wife, then they got divorced, and then he married his second wife literally weeks after the divorce came through. So he arrived in Beijing with a second wife in tow. Now we were aware of this because we do the background investigations. We know this kind of thing. So a little bit that I came there, but frankly, these kind of things are commonplace. I hate to say it. You divorce a wife, under whatever circumstances. So he arrived with his wife and a young child, and so that's fine. But while he was there in Beijing, no, within a short period of time, he had an affair with another NATO diplomat female, and that kind of came known, which did not bode well for him in the liaison office.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
he has an affection for women, not his wife, and that was what will come.
I
That
see.
will
The grass is always greener on the other side, I
well,
guess.
well, yes and no. I mean, I thought his second. I didn't know his first wife, Beverly, but his second wife, she was lovely, just a delightful young woman who was a great mother and a wife, as far as I knew. So she was
Hmm.
portrayed by him.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah,
Although maybe she feels like she got the last laugh in the end. Who knows?
I don't. I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah. So what happened later on with him? I mean, his career continued for many years after that, right? Like he kept going higher and higher within the department.
Well, what was interesting, 3 years later, while I was assigned to the American Embassy in Tokyo, he was assigned to the embassy in Tokyo.
Oh.
And so we didn't have a strong professional or social relationship, but we got along well because I just thought he was a smart and bright guy. And then his career just took off. Like I said earlier, when before he came to Beijing, he had a reputation, and his career went for Assistant Secretary of State INR, Assistant Secretary of State of Near East Asia. Oh, he was well regarded in the State Department, highly.
Hmm.
And in fact, he was being groomed to be the shadow ambassador to our so-called embassy in Taiwan, called the American Institute in Taiwan. So no, he was well regarded in the State Department.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I see. And so since you mentioned Taiwan again, did he end up going back to Taiwan or did he ended up in contact with the Taiwanese government like in the US at some point?
What happened was while he was Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Asian Affairs, part of his portfolio included Taiwan. So it would not be inconsistent for him in that position as Assistant Secretary of State to be dealing with diplomats in Washington, D.C., who were Japanese, Taiwanese, Burmese. That's part of his mission, not unlike what I said when he was assigned overseas. So for him in Washington, he'd be meeting Japanese diplomats, Chinese diplomats, also Chinese Japanese businessmen, and all those people connected to Asia at that particular time. Taiwan, of course, high on the list.
Hmm.
Let,
Okay.
let's be clear about this. Don Kaiser is not a friend of the Chinese Communist Party. He never was
Hmm.
when he was there. He never has been in his career. And so I think Don had an affection for the Taiwanese and their people and their government.
Okay. Okay, I see. So your book and particularly this portion, it brought up a point that I thought was very interesting and kind of unique to the department is the way that you handled relationships with members of foreign governments because in most of the US intelligence community, US government, those are very very frowned upon and very scrutinized, but of course that is the job of any State Department foreign service officer. So it was totally normal for him to have contact with a wide variety of people from all these different countries because that's a part of his job. So he didn't necessarily have to report all of these contacts, or at least feel like he didn't have to report all of these contacts in his clearance investigations and that sort of thing. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. I mean, again, it's not only diplomats. It would be totally consistent for Don Kaiser to meet Japanese journalists who are living here in Washington, D.C., reporting to the Asahi Shimbun. It'd be consistent for him meeting Korean businessmen and Korean journalists here in the United States, because that's his job to have that. On the other hand, we have what's called the contact reporting policy. And that is, if you are a State Department officer and you are engaged in either a social or a professional relationship with a foreign national, and you believe that that contact is now asking questions inconsistent with that professional or diplomatic relationship, you have to come to see it. On the other hand, there's a codicil to that, and that is if you believe that you contact a relationship with any individual, and that individual is an intelligence officer, you have to come and report into the Office of Counterintelligence. And that's in the Foreign Affairs Manual. That's a regulation you have to abide by.
Okay. Got it. So at some point along the way, his relationship with one of these Taiwanese personnel moves from the professional to the social, in a manner of speaking, right?
Well, the woman you're talking about is Isabelle Cheng. Isabelle Cheng was assigned to the Taiwanese Relations Office here. They don't have an embassy because we don't have total diplomatic relations with them. So this is called TECRO, Taiwan Economic, I forget the total name. So it would be consistent for Donald Kaiser to meet representatives of TECRO here in Washington, D.C., because TECRO would then sponsor Taiwanese businessmen who are coming to the United States in order to do business in the United States, be it chip technology, be it defense stuff, so that the Taiwanese community here in America and the Taiwanese diplomatic community in TECRO would host dinners, and Don Kaiser would be invited. And that Don and other State Department people and other individuals would attend these dinners and functions where Don would talk to these Taiwanese diplomats, totally consistent with his job as Assistant Secretary of State. Absolutely.
Okay. Did this start to raise eyebrows at any point? I mean, what happened exactly to kind of
not for the
create an incident?
Really? Well, not for the State Department, because he didn't report it in, and we can talk about later why he did not. What happened was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, was monitoring a couple of individuals at the TECRO office here in Washington, D.C., because the FBI believed that two individuals at the TECRO office were, in fact, intelligence officers. The first one, in fact, was declared, and his assistant was Isabelle Cheng, so that the FBI was monitoring Isabelle Cheng, and during their monitoring of her to see who she was meeting with or who she was seeing, they stumbled upon the fact that Isabelle Cheng was having lunches with Donald Kaiser. And for the FBI's counterintelligence office, knowing that suspecting that Isabelle Cheng was an intelligence officer, having lunches with an assistant secretary of state raised a lot of alarm bells.
I'll bet. So how did that proceed from there? Did they come and speak to someone from your office to begin with?
The FBI contacted the Office of Counterintelligence. They came in, and we were having the meeting, and they said, we want to bring an issue to you. Think you should be aware about. We have concerns. And Don Kaiser's name was brought up. And the first thing I said, Don Kaiser, that guy is apple pie and red, white, and blue. I mean, what? And then they started to show us how he was meeting her in a clandestine fashion. He was hiding her meetings with her. It appeared as though they were meeting in circumstances suggesting there might have been some intimacies. So I went back to our database, and it turned out that he had not been reporting anything. And Don had originally worked for the CIA before he joined the State Department. And we were absolutely convinced at that point that Don Kaiser knew that Isabelle Cheng was an intelligence officer. And under the contact reporting policy, the Foreign Affairs Manual, he should have come to our office and said, I am in a professional, not social, at least a professional relationship with Isabelle Cheng. He reported neither.
Okay. I mean, do you think that stems from him being over confident, or was it like a genuine desire to hide the relationship in general?
I think it's both, Justin. I think he believed he knew he could handle it. Given his background in the CIA and the State Department, he said, I'm never going to be compromised. This is ridiculous. I have a good
Okay.
relationship here. We're sharing. Absolutely.
Okay. I've got it. So ultimately, do you think that she had I mean, could she be described as a honeypot? Was it that simple, or was there more to it than that?
I fault to a NSB, National Security Bureau, Taiwanese officer who wrote a book years later in which he absolutely said Isabelle Cheng was sent to the United States to befriend Donald Kaiser.
Hmm. Okay. Dang, that was her whole mission. And so it worked, obviously. Do you know the extent to what that she was able to compromise him?
I don't think Donald Kaiser gave her the names of CIA officers and diplomatic cover. I don't think he gave her any information concerning military secrets. What I think Don Kaiser provided her was foreknowledge about how the American diplomatic talk was with Taiwan, probably helping Taiwan understand who the friends and enemies were in Asia. I think he tried to guide and provide them information that would help them survive the Chinese Communist Party threat. I Whatever information he gave her at the confidential and secret level, yeah, he violated the law. Sure, he did. But I don't think he violated anything more than sometimes what American diplomats do when they're dealing with counterparts in other parts of the world. But he should have
Hmm.
known better. He should have known better. He shouldn't have done it.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, certainly it's a complex situation there, no doubt about it. But Taiwan is generally, we're aligned with their interests and vice versa. So I guess that the idea is essentially he wasn't giving it to an adversary out of a desire to,
Right.
harm the U.S.
Absolutely. And he might have identified, I got to be careful here, he might have identified a couple of senators on the Hill that Taiwan may have wanted to put a little extra lobbying efforts to convince them
Hmm.
about sending arms sales, Harpoon missiles, or maybe some more Abrams tanks, and say, if you Taiwanese want to be, successful, here are the people you may want to talk to. Yeah, I mean, is that really top secret information? No, there's no evidence in our investigation that Don compromised top secret SCI or code root information.
Hmm.
No, not at all.
Okay. I see. How did all of this come to a head? Were they both arrested, or only him, or only her?
Well, what happened was it was the decision by the Department of Justice was what do we need to, what did the FBI and DS agents have to do to go forward with an espionage case? And it was decided the next time that Isabelle Cheng, Don Kaiser, and the Taiwanese intelligence officer got together for lunch. And if there was an envelope being passed, that they'd be stopped at that particular point. They would be stopped, not arrested, detained. The envelope would be opened. We would interview both Isabelle Cheng and Don Kaiser to go forward with the case. When we opened up the envelope, there was no classified document in it. There was a lot of written notes, a lot of annotations, and everything else. She, on the other hand, made an admission to the FBI officers that stunned all of us. She agreed to go back to the Tech Row offices and provide the cables, the written documentations that the Tech Row office had sent back to Taiwan after talking to Donald Kaiser. We were stunned that she was willing to
Oh
do
man.
that. And they drove her up to the Tech Row offices up in Northwest Washington, D.C., and she walked out with all these cables, these written documentations that the Taiwanese liaison office had sent back to Taipei, in which they identified Donald Kaiser as someone providing a lot of diplomatic and sensitive confidential information about diplomatic discourse.
My gosh.
We did not arrest her. We did not arrest him, and we let Don Kaiser go. The FBI. This is an FBI case, not a diplomatic security case. And Don Kaiser said, "You see, I'm not providing any classified documents." So he was released, and then we monitored him, and based off all the information after we reviewed what Isabelle Cheng had provided us, and so on and so forth, the Department of Justice said we authorize a search warrant of his house so that the FBI and diplomatic security executed a search warrant at his house, and that's when we found the thousands and thousands of secret and some top secret documents in the basement of his house.
Oh my gosh. I don't get why they do that ever. They see do that pretty often, it seems like, and I never understand why.
There was another case that's not in my book about another State Department. A lot of these State Department officers take these documents home only for the fact to write a book years later. No, I'm not. No, there was. I won't mention his name, but I had to investigate him because he was serving in Jordan, very senior member of embassy in Jordan. And when I actually interviewed him, and the FBI declined, the Department of Justice declined prosecution, I said, why do you have these thousands of documents?" And he said, I wanted to write a history between Israel and Jordan and the Americans' diplomatic relations, and I needed these documents. It would help me write a very cogent and concise story of the diplomatic history of our three countries for 15 years. And that's what he said. He wasn't.
Oh my gosh.
He wasn't going to give the information to anybody. He just wanted to write a good book. And
Yeah.
and the source documents were classified State Department cables and memoranda.
Yeah, I don't get it. Like, how are you going to cite those sources if anybody wants to, challenge your perspective or your, research abilities or anything like that? I don't really get it.
What he would probably do, Justin, is that 15 years later he'd file a FOIA request for those documents, and then see what documents would be released in whole or redacted, and then he'd fill in the blanks. I know these people. Oh gosh.
Oh my gosh.
I know how this works.
Yeah, that is clever. That is clever, I guess. As long as you don't get caught by Robert Booth.
Well, no, you don't get interviewed by Robert Booth. Robert Booth doesn't catch a lot of people. He helps the FBI and the intelligence community because they came to my office because I could decode the State Department's genealogy. I could decode the genetics. That's complicated for another agency. Yeah,
I see. So ultimately, back to Kaiser, what happened to him? Did he end up going to jail?
He did. And what was interesting, that he actually went to jail for violations of 18 U.S.C. 1001. And that was when he was interviewed by diplomatic security agents about his relationship with Isabelle Cheng and his travels and the contact reporting policy. He lied about it. And so the Department of Justice said, you're not going to get him for espionage, 18 U.S.C. 794E. We're not going to get him for unauthorized transmission because they couldn't prove it. But they said he did lie. So that was the baseball bat we used against him. Because remember, even in Martha Stewart in the stock exchange, selling her stocks, she didn't go to jail for fraud. She went to jail for lying to FBI agents. 1001. It's the biggest baseball bat we in law enforcement have. You lie to us under oath, you go to jail. And he went to jail for 1 year and 1 day.
Okay, so he's been out for quite some time.
Oh, gosh. Oh, Don's been out for 20 years, I think.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that has been a while.
Yeah.
Dang. Okay. Well, yeah, he got a light sentence compared to a lot of people that I talked to here. I know there's some mitigating circumstances there, certainly, but a lot of people go to jail for a lot longer than a year and a day.
He's a very lucky guy. I'll be candid with you. He's a very lucky guy. He did not cooperate. Part of the deal was he was supposed to cooperate with us in the debriefings. He did not. He was hostile. He lied. He fibbed. And so ultimately we threw the book at him, and the judge said the best he can do with 1001 is 1 year and 1. So he's a felon.
Yeah, he'll never get rid of that. I'm sure it's a real stain on what could have otherwise been a great career.
Oh, absolutely.
It was a great career for many years anyway.
He was. Absolutely. His career went to hell because his affections for women, not his wife.
Mm-hmm. Dang. What a shame.
Yeah.
So you have several other cases you talked about in the book as well, especially the Myers case, actually, which I've been wanting to talk about for quite some time. So I was glad to get the chance to read about it right from you. Can you talk a little bit about who the Myers were and how you became involved in the investigation into them?
Well, the fascinating thing about Kendall Myers is he's the great-grandson of Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. He's an American blue bud. His wife, on the other hand, was his second wife, Gwendolyn, and they had no biological children of that relationship, but they had children from their first relationships. She was a very simple individual. She was working at a bank. She had worked on Senator Aberzug's staff from North Dakota for a while. Kendall had joined the State Department later on in life as an educator at the Foreign Service Institute, teaching young men and women in the Foreign Service and other agencies who were going to serve overseas at embassies. Highly regarded, highly respected, highly intelligent. He had a PhD. He had an undergraduate degree from Brown University. He had a master's from Johns Hopkins. He had a PhD in English history from Johns Hopkins University. He's an intellectually bright guy and was doing very well in the State Department's Foreign Service Institute when the Office of Intelligence and Research, INR as it's called, is that part of the State Department that sees all the most significant and most sensitive information from the intelligence community. And their job is to analyze that information and share it within the State Department as to what components of that information are important for our diplomats, both in Washington, D.C., like Don Kaiser, and our ambassadors and staff overseas can learn about in order to conduct diplomatic relations. And when he got to INR, he saw just about everything.
Oh man, not good. So
no, not ultimately. It was not good.
Yeah, it didn't seem like there was anything wrong with that initially, of course, but that's usually the case.
And the thing,
so
when we on his background investigations, every 5 years you undergo a background investigation. And when the diplomatic security agents, the others, talked to all his friends and his colleagues and his next door neighbors, everybody said, he's a great guy. He's a great guy. And he was. But that's the thing about people have a clandestine life. They learn how to hide that. And read Le Carrier's books. He's got it right. As a double agent, you learn how to hide your private life and not talk about it. And if you're smart and intelligent, most of your neighbors and friends will never know that you're clandestine.
Yep, absolutely. So the two of them, as you mentioned in the book, of course, they began spying for Cuba, which is unexpected for a lot of reasons. But can you explain how that came about exactly?
Well, when Kendall was working at the Foreign Service Institute, and that's the educational component of the State Department, which educates all sorts of people in the State Department. In other words, the Foreign Service Institute actually invites any number of foreign personnel, journalists, diplomats, businessmen to come to the Foreign Service Institute and give a talk about their country. It can be Korea, it can be Japan, it can be South Africa. They can invite a journalist, a diplomat. And at one particular point, the Foreign Service Institute decided to ask a Cuban diplomat stationed at the Cuban mission at the United Nations in New York to come down to the Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C., and give a talk to the Foreign Service students about Cuba. So the gentleman's name was Ciano, and he was allowed to travel down to Washington, D.C., to come to the Foreign Service Institute, and he gave a talk about Cuba. And of course, he presented Cuba in a way that's probably not how most people would view Cuba, a very positive view of Fidel Castro, and not, what was Cuba doing in South America at that time, and how they were treating their own people, human rights and religion and so on. But what he did was he said, listen. And so at the end of his speech, the audience, there are DIA people, CIA people, Treasury people, State people in the audience who started peppering him with a lot of questions. And he finally said, look, if any of you want to come to Cuba, I'll help you get there, and you can see the glorious revolution that exists in Cuba. And then months later, Kendall Myers and two other Foreign Service Institute people took him up on the offer, asked permission from the State Department to travel to Cuba to take him up on this. The State Department said, you pay for it, you can go. So he traveled to Cuba with these two Foreign Service Institute individuals to get their take on Cuba. What he did while he was there, unfortunately, was every night he had a diary in which he wrote his perceptions and views of what he was seeing in Cuba. And everything he wrote in this diary was so positive. Cuba's great, Castro's great, the Cuban people have a great life. Back in the United States, we had the Vietnam War, Black people are being nailed down in Alabama, ERA's not going well, rioting on the streets. Cuba is a paradise. And he'd leave his diary in his book every day when he went visiting around Havana. Well, the Cuban intelligence service went into his room, read his diary. It was almost like an offer. Hey, I'm a pro-Castro guy. And so eventually when he returned to the United States, he went back to Foreign Service Institute. Unfortunately for him, his wife's mother was in a very bad state, so he resigned from the Foreign Service Institute in the State Department, moved to North Dakota to be with his mother-in-law to take care of him. The Cubans found out where he was, and Ciano, the guy who had given the talk at the Foreign Service Institute, was given the authority by the Cuban intelligence service to fly from New York, where he was living. He flew to Mexico, changed his identity, flew into the United States, got to North Dakota, and one night calmly went up to Kendall Myers' house, knocked on his door, and said, "Hi, Kendall, how you doing?"
Amazing.
Yeah,
Incredible.
and shows you how good the Cuban intelligence service is.
Yeah, I've heard and read some very good things about them. They are pros.
They are very good. They only have one enemy. Unlike the United States, who has to look at the Chinese, the North Vietnamese, the Russians, the Nicaraguans, the Venezuelans, Cuban intelligence service only focuses on one, the United States. That's why they're so good.
Man, yeah, that's an excellent point, actually, now that I think about it. So how did Kendall take that meeting? That must have been a shock for him, but apparently it went well.
Well, I don't know if it was a shock. I mean, I spent hours with Kendall Myers in debriefings, and he said, "Come on in." And for the next 4 days, Kendall and Ciano walked around the town. They visited an American Indian reservation. They talked about how the indigenous Americans were treated. They did a lot of cultural things around North Dakota. And then finally, after the fourth day, Ciano just sat down with Kendall over a wine or a cup of coffee, I'm not sure which one it was, and said, "We would like you to work for us." Just that simple. Kendall said, "I will do it only one condition, and that's only if my wife agrees to do it." So he called his wife into the room. They're in his house. Gwendolyn looked at him and they said, "We're on board. We're your spies."
Wow. That worked out incredibly well for the Cubans then, huh?
The Cubans had identified him perfectly.
So this is many, many years ago, of course. How long did his career working for the Cubans go before he was eventually caught, or before they were caught?
Oh, goodness. Again, I got to be careful about this. I haven't looked at my book in some time. It was about 10 to 12 years that he was fully working for the Cubans, because initially at the Foreign Service Institute, he did not have access. What happened was, after the mother was mitigated, she passed away, he came back to Washington, D.C., and he reapplied to the State Department, the Foreign Service Institute, and he was brought back in. So the Foreign Service Institute, he really did not have access to really kind of sensitive information. But unfortunately, he did have access to a lot of the names of intelligence officers who were coming through the Foreign Service Institute. So he was able to provide those names to the Cubans, who eventually passed it on to the Russians, so that if an intelligence officer traveled overseas under non-official cover or diplomatic cover, that they would have known about that, which is, of course, very devastating to our intelligence community. And the one thing he told me about in a debriefing was that he would stay behind at the Foreign Service Institute at night. He'd stay after 5:30 on a Friday. And there was a CIA officer who was assigned to the Foreign Service Institute, because the CIA officer was responsible for getting CIA people into the classes that the Foreign Service Institute provided. And unfortunately for the CIA, this officer brought his restricted telephone directory of the CIA into his office. And Kendall Myers went into the CIA officer's cubicle there at the Foreign Service Institute, found this restricted telephone directory with all the people's names and telephone numbers, made photocopy of the entire CIA telephone directory, and sent it off to Cuba. That's what a person who doesn't necessarily have access to TS. But the CIA officer made a terrible mistake.
If you're looking for another discreet way to carry survival or emergency gear, look no further than the new Covert Mark I briefs from Sotira Systems. The Mark Is feature thigh pockets on either side, large enough for a phone, radio, passport, or other documents. The waistband contains 9 slots for small items such as handcuff keys, SD and SIM cards, padlock shims, and the like. The elastic band keeps them snug but accessible. The covert Mark I's are designed with comfort and utility at their core and are manufactured from high-grade wicking and fast-drying sports fabric. They can easily replace a traveler's belt pack, which is far more likely to be stolen from you during a robbery than the briefs you're wearing. Covert Mark I briefs are configurable and suitable for anyone in law enforcement, military service, or even the security-conscious global traveler. Find them at soterasystems.co.uk. That's SOTEIRA systems.co.uk, or at the link in the show notes of this episode, and use the discount code Spycraft101 to save 10% off your order. Geez, yeah, a little slip up like that, and you don't think anything of it at the time, probably, but devastating consequences.
Absolutely. Hundreds of names are compromised. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, because of his expertise in United Kingdom and U.S. relations, and he was brilliant, the Office of Intelligence INR brought him in to INR in Washington, D.C., and then his clearance went to top secret SCI because he was now able to see the most sensitive information. But when he left FSI to come to INR, he had to undergo a background investigation. We did the entire investigation, and there was no evidence of all the people we talked to, running his name by the CIA and the FBI. No one had any indication, any clear evidence that Kendall Myers is nothing other than a highly smart PhD FSI guy who is now going to go work at the Office of Intelligence and Research.
Yeah, just slip through again. So what was it eventually that led people to look in his direction, so to speak?
Well, what happened was the FBI opened up an investigation based off intercepts that the NSA had been able to decode, which indicated that there was an individual who, based off the analysis of the decoded messages, had to have been a U.S. government employee working in Washington, D.C. Now, Justin, how many people are we talking about? 150,000 on any given day?
Oh, yeah.
And the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and other individuals eventually were able to suggest that based off other stuff that I was never allowed to see, and rightfully so, they said it's got to be one of two agencies, and one of the agencies was State Department. So eventually, the case had been going on for over 9 years when an FBI agent by the name of Kate Alleman, who is a dear friend of mine, both professionally and socially, came to me and said, there is information in the community that we cannot share with the State Department because you State Department people don't take polygraphs. And because the NSA is the holder of the decoding, the NSA says you can't share that information with State Department, Bureau of Diplomatic Security personnel. But Kate Alleman said, and she knew me, we'd worked, in fact, she and I had worked on a case that's going to be my second book. She said, Robert, I trust you. You're not a spy. I know you haven't taken a polygraph, but I want you to come over to the FBI headquarters and I want to show you the NSA decodings with 3 FBI analysts. So one evening, myself and another State Department agent went over to the FBI headquarters, and in a closed skiff, they allowed me to see NSA decrypts and decodings that the NSA would not be happy for me to have been allowed to see.
Okay, wow. So that narrowed it considerably then. So was it ultimately you that identified him as the best possible suspect?
Well, what happened was the FBI said this case has been going on for 9 years. And this is the thing about why other agencies come to us in understanding State Department genealogy. The first thing I said was, are you telling me the Cuban messages being sent up by foreign FM transmissions have been going on for 10 years? I said, yeah. And I said, well, wait a minute. That means your suspect cannot be a foreign service officer because foreign service officers have to serve overseas every 3 to 4 years. So if these messages have been sent up for 10 years, That means your suspect is a civil service officer.
Hmm.
And I'm in this room with all these analysts and FBI agents. And for me, it took me all of 5 minutes to reduce the total number of suspects by 95%. And over 9 years, because we weren't allowed to have done that, it didn't happen.
Wow. Amazing.
I know.
Had to clear that red tape finally, huh?
Well, Kate Alleman is the reason why Kendall Myers is in jail today. So what happened was the FBI shared additional information with me based off the decrypts, and we created a profile of 15 different indicators. And what I was able to do with those indicators was go to our human resources file. I had to go on a computer and get someone else to help me. At one point, we actually crashed the computers because we're asking so much information. And eventually, the computer kicked out 22 names. And from those 22 names, on the 13th file was Kendall Myers. And when I started to read his file, and reading a file like that, they're huge. Your brain goes nuts in reading these personnel files of State Department employees because there's so much stuff in there. But that's the stuff that was critical, and eventually me going to the FBI and saying, if the NSA information is correct and our analysis correct, the only possible person is Kendall Myers. That was me who did it.
Wow. Shaved many more years potentially off of that investigation, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, I mean he was getting close to retirement, but had the FBI not allowed me to see the NSA decrypts, he would have gotten away. Absolutely, he would have gotten away.
That's amazing. Yeah, they were very good at covering their tracks and not raising too many flags, obviously. So did things proceed very quickly at that point once you had an actual suspect, or was there still like a lot that had to happen?
Well, the thing is, once we'd identified the individual, we were able to go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and I had to write a codicil up for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act here in Washington, D.C., which allowed us to put a camera in his office space in the State Department, and also allowed us to put a microphone in his house in Washington, D.C. And so we were able to start to collect evidence of espionage activities.
Okay, and so was that all that you really needed at that point, or did you also need to like extract a confession during a final interview or anything like that as well?
Well, the thing we really wanted to do was catch him passing classified information to a Cuban intelligence officer. But those days are over with. What you simply do is you get the information, you load it up onto a flash drive, you go to you go to an internet cafe, you download it on an anonymous computer, and you send it to a cutout in Mexico. So the days of catching someone like, Hansen trying to drop off classified documents in a bag in a park, those days are gone. So, it's very hard these days to catch a spy doing what traditionally would catch spies doing. That's actually handing the document to an intelligence officer of another country.
Mm-hmm.
So he was not doing it.
Yeah.
So we were monitoring him, and we were seeing some very suspicious activity on the internet cafe. We saw some very suspicious activity. The camera focused on him in his office space. We saw a lot of suspicious activity, but nothing that the Department of Justice was willing to give an arrest warrant for, and rightfully so. He's very good. He's not a dumb person.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, he was a very smart guy. So ultimately, how did you secure the arrest and the conviction, as a matter of fact?
What happened was he retired from the State Department, and therefore he really didn't have access to classified information. So the chances of us, the investigating team, catching him, passing classified information had passed. So the decision was reached that we would do what's called a false flag. What happens was the intelligence community would identify an individual who would then approach Kendall Myers. At that point, he was still teaching at John Hopkins University, approach him with a special, what we call a parole. He had the right words to approach Kendall saying, I'm X, I'm a bona fide Cuban intelligence officer, we want to reconnect. And luckily for us, it was beautifully set up. And Kendall Myers approached on his birthday on Johns Hopkins University, offered a Cohiba cigar by this gentleman purportedly to be a Cuban intelligence officer. Hey, Kendall, you've been retired, 8, 9, 10 years from now, 8, 9, 10 months from now. We'd like to reestablish our relationship. And luckily for us, he bit. Had he said no, he would have gotten away with it.
Oh, man. That's amazing. And I understand all the legal justification and ramifications of all that, but it really must be terribly frustrating to absolutely know who is doing what, but not be able to put them in jail unless a very specific set of circumstances occur.
Right. It's very important to understand it's the Department of Justice that makes the ultimate decision on whether an arrest is made. The DOJ prosecutors has to look at all the evidence we provide to them, and they say, can we convince a jury? And these juries are not stupid. These juries, unfortunately, have seen way too many Hollywood movies. They expect to see videos of the guy photocopying and handing it over, and that's not what it is. So these prosecutors say, depending on where the case is going to actually be held, can a jury understand what we're talking about when we present this evidence? So it's not the FBI or diplomatic security special agents to make the decision. It's the Department of Justice prosecutors.
Yeah. I mean, everybody has their own priority. Every different section and organization has their own priorities. I have to imagine, I've never been in the position, but it's got to be unbelievably frustrating to have this case that you've been working on for a very long time. Maybe you think it's kind of the pinnacle of your career, and then DOJ, either they decline to prosecute or they offer a super attractive plea deal to the person so they can close it quickly and move on or something like that. And maybe you don't think that it's gotten the attention or the gravity that it deserves. I would imagine that's happened a few times.
Oh, it has, Justin. And I'm not talking out of school here. There are a number of State Department officers who got away with it. Absolutely. And that's just the way it is. That if we cannot provide enough information that DOJ is going to feel comfortable prosecuting, there are 2 State Department officers who passed away over the last couple of years, who I know spied against the U.S. government.
Oh, wow.
And they were never prosecuted. One never came back to the United States.
Really? No. Are there articles about this, or is it all kind of
absolutely not? It's in my memory. I really can't go into full details about it. And there's the kind of funny thing about 20 years later, there are just a lot of cases out there that remain unresolved. They're what we call unsubs, unknown subjects. No, let me take that back. We know who they are, and in my heart of hearts, I know of a couple who absolutely were espionage agents for foreign intelligence services who got away with it. Yeah. I'll tell you one. Rita Martinez. Ms. Martinez was a USAID employee. She was a spy for the Cubans. She helped recruit Ana Montes, Operation No Blues, that the book by Jim Popkin just came out. Martinez, I was working with the FBI. She was assigned to our embassy in South America. We were going forward with an espionage case, and that we were working very hard. At the final moment, she married a Swedish diplomat. We were stunned. Before we could do anything, she moved to Sweden with her Swedish husband. And what could we do? We had enough case against her that DOJ went to the Swedes, and the Swedes said, we do not have extradition for political crimes. Espionage is a political crime. So Martinez, the DOJ then unsealed her indictment. If she ever comes to a country in Europe that's under European laws, she will be extradited back to the United States. She is an American-Cuban spy in Sweden who got away with it. You go online and find her indictment. No, and she got away with it. She's one of the named ones who got away with it. But there's others.
Yeah. I was familiar with her. So when Jim Popkin's book came out, we interviewed him here on the podcast. That was
Jim. Okay, I've talked to Jim. Yeah.
She came up briefly in another episode that we did a long time ago. Daniel Golden, he wrote a book called Spy Schools.
Okay.
He talked about her a little bit because Ana Montes was recruited while she was a student.
Yes, at Johns Hopkins University, where Ken Myers was teaching.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was a name that was familiar to me, but it sounds like you know a lot of others as well that are probably not familiar to us.
I can't give the names, but it's very frustrating. Could we have gone to court? I think in two of the cases we could have, but there were a lot of circumstances that the Department of Justice said no. And like in one case, the gentleman never came back to the United States and he passed away overseas.
Okay. Yeah, I have to wonder about that kind of thing. Like, okay, yeah, I'm not in jail, but I can also never go home again either, which in a way is a little bit, it's a punishment of its own.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Monaquez actually was particularly very pro-American. Well, she's probably American, but she's anti-U.S. government.
Yeah. I gotcha. Thanks. Well, yeah, she's probably living her best life out there in Sweden still, and maybe she'll slip up one day, but maybe not. I'm sure she knows the stakes.
Well, now that Sweden is a part of NATO or got about to get there, maybe justice can be served.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe her days are numbered. Who knows?
She can't travel to most countries in Europe because they're all part of Interpol, and Interpol has a red flag on them.
Okay, yeah. So there's been some consequences so far, but maybe not as many as are deserved in that particular case.
Yeah.
So how did things end up with the Myers then? In that case, were you there for any interviews after the arrest or anything? I know that you did see him in the courtroom later on, right?
Right, and the courtroom initial arrest and everything went very quickly. It was kind of sad because his family members were in there, and the indictment was like 1,000 pages. And when they were starting to read the indictment, they kept shaking their heads because his family members had no clue he was a spy. Reading it, it's just kind of devastating to realize a loved family member had a second life. Eventually, when he agreed to 18 U.S.C. 794E espionage, conspiracy with espionage, passing classified information, he agreed to plead guilty if there was consideration given to his wife, Gwendolyn. And let me be clear here, he loved his wife, Gwendolyn, with all his heart. And he did everything he could to save her. And she eventually got 81 years in federal confinement, while he is now serving life in Florence, Supermax in Colorado. Also, as part of his plea bargain agreement, he agreed to sit down after the FBI did the first debriefings. I and the State Department counterintelligence team had the next shot at him. We had him for 5 days, and it was 18 hours of total debriefings and conversations with Kendall.
Wow. So she was obviously knowledgeable of this right from day one, quite literally, but was she taking part in the transfer of this sensitive information as well in any way, or would she just go to jail for knowing and not reporting?
No, she was 100% conspirator. What she would do, Kendall Myers was brilliant. What he would do is during the course of the day at the State Department, he would talk to people because he was not a Cuban person. He was not a South American expert. But in the Office of Intelligence and Research, he knew the Cuban specialists. And every now and then he'd go up to them and say, "Hey, how's our friend Fidel doing?" And of course, they'd give him a full breakdown of what INR was suspecting, what the CIA, the DOD was sharing information with us about Cuba. And then the INR people would share the information with Kendall. And he'd listen to them patiently. He'd go back to his office and on a piece of paper write down key words. As he told me during the debriefings, he learned how to have a great memory. He'd get back to his house in Northwest Washington, D.C., pull out the piece of paper, and Gwendolyn would sit down with her laptop. And then Kendall would use that piece of paper and those keywords to recreate and reconstruct the conversation he had a couple hours ago with the Cuban experts in INR. She would type it all up. She would download it into a flash drive. She would go to the internet cafe and send it to Peter Herrera, the Cuban cutout in Mexico. He was a 100% conspirator. 100%.
Yeah, no doubt. Amazing. That is, I'm sure there's other cases. I can't think of one other one, though, where someone brought their spouse in right from the very beginning like that, and the spouse, bought in immediately either. That seems like a very rare situation to me.
You'd have to go back to the atomic spies in 1950.
Yeah. That makes 2 in 70 years there. Dang. Not very often. Yeah, I'm trying to think of any other there have been husband and wife teams, but they were put together in most cases. I can't think of one where the wife was like, oh, what? Okay, I'm down for that too.
I agree. I certainly can't think of any State Department cases.
Yeah. Thanks. So life in prison for him, and so she is out now. You said 81 months. Is that right?
What is interesting about she was serving in a female federal penitentiary in Texas, and one of her roommates was Anna Montez.
Oh, interesting. They had a lot to talk about.
Well, I'm not sure they were allowed to talk. I don't know whether they were segregated or not. She got out some years ago. She had the reason why she went to this facility in Texas because it also has a hospital. She's always had a bad heart problem. She did pass away a couple of years ago after she was in jail. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Kendall is still in Florence, and he's never getting out.
Yeah. Well, that's the consequence for everything that he did over so many years.
Absolutely.
So one of the other big portions of your book as well is just about leaks to the press, and that was another eye-opener for me as well. So can you tell us a little bit about how frequently that came up, people just turning information over to journalists rather than foreign intelligence officers?
Well, this is kind of a complicated issue about how cozy State Department officers or White House officials or DOD officials get with journalists. There is a understanding that there is going to be sharing of information between State Department, in this case, State Department officers and journalists, when the State Department wants to put its best face on an incident that's occurring, when they want information shared in the newspapers that's not coming directly from the State Department, but has gone through a bit of massaging, has got through a bit of diplomatic language, so that when the United States is trying to explain what's going on technically right now in the Ukraine and what's going on in Israel, that the State Department gets its message across without just flat out leaking information. But a lot of times that when the State Department people are talking to journalists and others, they in fact are, in a sense, declassifying sensitive information so that this data gets out in a way they prefer it to get out. It's not unusual. It goes back to the 1950s when the secretaries of state would sit down with journalists in their homes in Georgetown and have talks and review policy. And they would the journalists and the State Department people actually engage in a debate on our foreign policy before it was actually published. So this has a long, the word I hate to use is rich, but a rich history of cooperation between the State Department and journalists and the newspapers.
Yeah, I found that very surprising and eye-opening because it seems like in any other agency, bureaucracy within the U.S. government, if someone, a rank and file member of the organization is like, oh yeah, I'm friends with a journalist, oh yeah, we meet for drinks once a month or something like that, that would raise a lot of eyebrows at a bare minimum, if not require some retraining or strong counseling or something of that nature. But it seems relatively common just from reading your book in the State Department anyway.
In the State Department, it's clear senior State Department people have access to journalists and certainly members of the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's clear. Mm-hmm. They may deny it, but it's true.
Yeah, I see. So, and I recall reading that you yourself were suspected of being a leaker at one point, weren't you?
This was a case involving Ambassador Rhodes to a country in Africa, and somebody had made the allegation or accusation that while he was serving as an ambassador, and he was an ambassador at the time, was using cocaine. A girlfriend was coming in from the United States to visit periodically, X, Y, and Z. I had to do the investigation. The investigation concluded that there was cocaine in his body. It had no national security implications. There was no allegations of criminality. There was no allegations of national security information being leaked. But I was head of our Office of Professional Responsibility at that time. It was called Special Investigations, Professional Responsibility. And so I conducted the investigation. It was close hold. It was very sensitive. Ambassador Rhodes was a personal appointee ambassador by President Bush. And I wrote the investigation up and I sent it up to my boss. 4 days later, whole sections of my investigation were leaked to the Washington Post. And I found that appalling. But I was called into the office and I was semi-accused of saying, Robert, did you leak this information to the Washington Post? And I said, absolutely not. Why? I have no interest in revealing the results of my investigation. I don't know Ambassador Rhodes. Uh, I don't. It's just it has no personal interest to me. I mean, I do all these investigations. I forward the results up. I'm not on the board recommending punishment. I just forward them up. But yeah, I mean, Clark Dittman, the director of the bureau, called me in his office and kind of gave me a hard time about it. But I was able to convince him I didn't. I didn't leak it. I have no reason to leak it. It would look bad on our office or my shop to do it. It was a very senior member of the State Department who leaked it. And I have to believe it was someone who did not like the fact that he was a political appointee of the Bush administration, and so they were just trying to denigrate him and get him brought back as ambassador to Rhodesia, which it was Zimbabwe. I'm sorry.
Hmm. Hmm. I see. So I take it then that these leaks, usually it's not like a case of cash exchanging hands for information like it is with foreign intelligence officers. It's about like politics or vendetta or something like that. Is that normally the kind of motivator for some of these leaks?
Yeah, what most leaks occur because, first of all, you want to support your position. When in the press someone says, well, the State Department is doing this in Gaza, or the State Department is doing this in Kiev, based off that journalist's initial reporting. The State Department then will try to mitigate that initial story by reaching out to journalists and, hey, wait a minute, that article you just wrote yesterday, let me give you some background because you're just not getting it right. And so, no, I get that. So that's what happened. And the other time, there might be a conflict within, let's say, in the State Department between certain bureaus in the State Department and, let's say, DIA or DOD, and that the conflict, like maybe what we're doing, what we did in Lebanon, 20 years ago when the bombing occurred over 20 years ago, that DOD and State Department are having a battle behind the scenes. Well, the State Department may want to get a friendly journalist in to say, hey, this activity in Lebanon that's going on, this is what the real story is, so that the State Department gets its view out there. The really damaging side is when you have someone in the State Department who then is willing to go to the press and provide information that is sensitive and is not approved or authorized by senior members of the State Department. That makes the big difference because I would say, in my opinion, 85% of what they call leaks or unauthorized disclosures to the press are authorized by senior State Department people. Don't kid yourself. They're authorized. And DOD is the same, and CIA is the same. It's the 10 to 15% when an individual substitutes his oath for his own personal feelings and says, I'm like Snowden, reality winners. I'm assuming you know these names.
Yes. Yeah,
leak the information to the press. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I've got you. Okay. I see. So there was one case that you went through. If you don't mind kind of walking us through this investigation regarding a classified cable from Buenos Aires, I think it was, that caused quite a stir.
Yeah. This shows you how this works. We had a delegation led by, he was Speaker of the House at the time, Tip O'Neill of Massachusetts. And he came down to Argentina on what was called a congressional delegation, a CODEL. And this happens all the time. Congressional delegations come down, they meet members of the local government, they meet people in the press, they meet all sorts of people. It's a feel-good relationship. It also allows local people to meet non-State Department people and meet members of Congress who have their own views. And it's very neutral to begin with. But in this particular case, at that particular time, Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States, and there was the Nicaragua issue going on. And what happened was when Tip O'Neill got down with his congressional delegation down there, Tip O'Neill and the Democrats on that delegation was kind of hitting up the Argentinians to oppose Ronald Reagan and his South American views. And Tip O'Neill kind of put the arm on the Argentinian president to, go easy and not be so pro Ronald Reagan. Well, the ambassador to Argentina at that was Frank Ortiz, was appalled to see members of Congress coming to a foreign country and kind of putting pressure on a head of state. I mean, that's not Congress's job. I mean, they should be passing appropriation bills. not coming down to Argentina and really pushing on any case. Frank Cortez writes a very candid telegram. A telegram is like a laptop email that goes back in our own communication systems, highly restricted and so on, in which he gave a very candid appraisal of how he thought Tip O'Neill and the congressional delegation conducted itself. And the cable came back, I think, on a Friday, and by Monday afternoon, it was in the press.
Oh,
so, so needless to say, Clark Dittmer, the same guy who brought me in, to say, Robert, did you leak the story about Ambassador Rhodes? He brings me in the office. Robert, you got to do the investigation. Everybody, the senior State Department people are hot about this. Everyone's hot about it. We got to find out how it leaks. So I started an investigation to try to determine who and how it might have been leaked. Ultimately, I found a political appointee in the Office of Political Military Affairs who had leaked the information to a gentleman in the Washington Times. And he did it because he was a partisan. And in the State Department, we do have partisans, both Democrats and Republicans. 30% of any ambassadorship under any president is all political. 30% of all ambassadors overseas are political. And we have a number of political appointees inside the State Department. In this particular case, this individual was in a very sensitive position. He saw the cable. He thought it was inappropriate. He was a Republican. He thought it was inappropriate for a Democrat such as Tip O'Neill to conduct himself in such a fashion. So what I ultimately decided was he wanted to embarrass Tip O'Neill. And so he leaked it to the Washington Times.
Okay. How long did that one take you to get to the bottom of? Was that like a very long investigation?
No. I'm very lucky in my career. I was able to find two individuals during the course of interviews who allowed me to focus on this one gentleman very quickly.
Okay, nice. So did he ultimately admit to it to your face when you were talking to him, or did it come to something else?
What happened was he got a lawyer, and his lawyer cut an agreement with the State Department's legal staff that he would agree to talk to me about that case only with limited admissions. The Department of Justice was not willing to prosecute because, honestly, he didn't leak classified information. It was not national security information. The information he provided to Kreitzberg of the Washington Times was the candid observations of a U.S. ambassador about Tip O'Neill. Frankly, no national security interest. Well, it did cause an issue that some Argentinian delegates in the future said, we're not going to talk to you people because, we don't trust you guys. But no national security information. And DOJ said, we're going to go in front of a jury and try to convince him. It's not even classified. So the agreement reached by the State Department's legal counsel and this gentleman's lawyer was he'd come and admit that he did it, and then we'd fire him. And we fired him.
Oh, okay. So he was
he was fired. He submitted his resignation to the Secretary of State, and he acknowledged that he was guilty. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And then I interviewed him, and he made the same admission. Yeah.
Ah, I see. Okay, so that's, in a way that takes care of the problem, obviously, but I guess he doesn't lose his security clearance or have any other
his security
black mark. It was just a resignation on his resume.
Once he acknowledged that his security clearance was absolutely revoked, then he was fired. Yeah, he would never get a security clearance. His name is in my book. Try to hide from that, my friend.
right, exactly. Okay.
Go Google his name. I'm sure he's leading a very quiet, peaceful life right now.
Yeah. Oh man. Not once I find him. Yeah, I'll have to. I don't recall his name right now from the book, but I'll have to look it up again now that you mention it.
Oh gosh, I'd like to. I'll remember it in a second here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. His name was actually in the reason why I was able to mention his name because initially when I submitted my book to pre-publication review, they said, Robert, you can't put his name in your book because it's not public. And then lucky I was able to find an article in the Baltimore Sun in which his name was absolutely mentioned. So I was able to put his name in my book. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Interesting. So yeah, that was the death knell for him was releasing that stuff. And then I guess do you think he knew what was going on as soon as the investigation kind of zeroed in on him, or was he
Oh,
trying to hide his involvement?
the moment he came into my interview room when I did the interview, I thought I'd have to put a seatbelt on his seat. He just could not stop shaking, bopping, fingers, hands going everywhere. I mean,
Oh man.
he's not a trained intelligence officer. He, in fact, during interviews with others, the reason why his name came to me was because other people around him had found he'd been very indiscreet at social settings. And in fact, at a party in Washington, D.C., he had actually was seen talking to a foreign journalist in which he was commenting that about things I've seen in the State Department. The only difficulty was those people who then told me later on that he was indiscreet. Why didn't they come to see us months before saying, gee, the State Department officer is indiscreet? But again, tattling on others is not something that you find in society today. People don't tattle on or tell on others. So that's a hard thing we in counterintelligence have to deal with.
Hmm. Absolutely. So I know that there were many other leaks that you ultimately had to investigate, kind of endemic, as a matter of fact, and all of those are covered in the book. So I don't want to go over all of
Well,
them, of
no,
course.
all I'll say is that's only a small slice that I had to do. For those who replaced me in the Office of Special Investigations or Internal Affairs, I can't imagine the number they have to do.
Hmm. Yeah, I would imagine it's only gotten worse over
Oh,
time.
sure. Absolutely.
Wow. So amazing stuff, Robert. I don't want to give away everything in the book because I want people to read it just like I had the opportunity to as well. So for those of you who are listening, the book once again is State Department Counterintelligence, Leaks, Spies, and Lies. And Robert, I believe you mentioned that you personally have a few copies on hand that are available right now, right?
Right. If anybody would like a signed copy of my book, here's what I ask you to do. Send me an email to my address. It's swampfox1, SWAMPFOX, Arabic numeral 1, at verizon.net. Include your address. It's $20. I'll send it before you send me the check or the bill, and I'll get it out to you. I have 52 copies left. That's it. My contract with Brown Books ended about 9 months ago, so I don't know how many copies are available on Amazon, but I have 52. The first 52, I'll get it out to you. Thank you for Justin.
Okay, fantastic. I think this is the first time that we've had signed copies available from one of my guests, from one of my author guests. Anyway, so this is definitely a rare opportunity for anybody who wants to read a lot more. And we have not by any means covered all the stories that Robert has to share. There are honestly dozens in there, some big ones, as a matter of fact, that I deliberately left out because the book is so great. I want you guys to read it as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, Robert, what are you working on right now?
Well, my second book is about 3 U.S. citizens, University of Wisconsin students who actually were recruited, believe it or not, by the East German Intelligence Service in the 1970s. They then became spies for the East Germans. They moved to Washington, D.C. One worked for the Department of Defense as a lawyer. The other two were able to worm their way into people who had access to classified information. And unfortunately, in one case, one of these German spies was able to meet 2 State Department officers here in Washington, D.C., at after hours sessions at George Washington University, and unfortunately was able to get them to provide him with very sensitive classified information, which he then sent back to East Germany. All 3 were arrested by the FBI and were convicted in federal court here in Washington. It's an old case, but it's a case that's lost to time. It's a case I was involved in. I just want to be a part of the historical record.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. That is right up my alley for sure. So I'm looking forward to that one. Do you have a title already or a publication date, or is it still in the works?
Well, right now, the book is in pre-publication review. So I'm waiting for the State Department to get it back to me. At that particular point, I will self-publish. But what I'll do, Justin, once I have everything, I'll reach out to you and let you know where it's going.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing I love to learn about.
Yeah, I would love to have it open like I did last time at the International Spy Museum. I'll reach out to my contacts there. So when the book is ready to go, I do a debut there and do a speech on this
Oh,
book.
terrific. Terrific. Yeah, that'll be a fun event.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you mentioned your email address earlier. Do you have a website as well? I think. Are you pretty active on there if people want to contact you there?
Well, no, the website just simply has my speeches and my talks. I've written articles. I've given talks. I teach at the University of Texas. I teach at Catholic University, and sometimes some of the talks I do are on videos there. I've gotten talks at the International Spy Museum. So all that's there, and some of the interviews that I've done with the Washington Post and others, and radio casts I've done with WTOP about what happened in Cuba with what people believe is an ionization machine being used against our diplomats down there. So my website is just strictly what I talk about and do. It's not an interactive thing at all.
Okay, I've got you. Okay, good. Well, they can still read some more of what you've written, though, which I'm sure they'll be eager to do.
Okay.
Well, fantastic, Robert. I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to reading your next book and getting in touch about that one again pretty soon.
Okay, that's great.
Great. Well, thank you for the time today. I really appreciate it. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.